Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, and a very good evening, I bid to my fellow viewers out there who is watching this video. So, before we go into what we are trying to talk about in today's findings, let me introduce myself first. So, the name given is Muhammad Haris Hanafi bin Muhammad Johari, and I am from PISMP TSLD August intake from 2023, and I will be ending my degree in 2028. So for today's video, we are going to talk about the coursework for TSLB 3273, which falls under the English Language Awareness for the performance presentation. So the performance presentation will be about the context of English language use, which is topic 2 for TSLB 3273. But for today's coursework, we are going to talk about the context of language use in the Malaysian primary classroom. So that is the introduction. Let us move on to the next slide. So we're moving on to the assessment part, which is the part where I need to adhere for my coursework. So it goes task one, performance presentation, which will cover up 20% for this course. And the stimulus goes context of situation forms part of context of culture. By context of culture is meant the meanings, assumptions we share as a community of people, and it also incorporates the culturally evolved expectations of ways of behaving and getting things done. So this is basically the stimulus that I need to adhere for my research, for my findings, and anything that is related with this topic. So from the stimulus, it stated that based on the statements above, I need to select two types of context that I have learned in this course, which is either situational, cultural, or interpersonal. And then from these three, I have to choose two, which I have chose situational context and also cultural context. So from the selected context, I must give examples that is related to the Malaysian primary school classroom. And also every examples, every briefings, every elaborations needs to be clear and precise. And also for this presentation, I have to do it for around 30 minutes. So I hope that this video will reach until 30 minutes or maybe less. So there's a few notes that I have to adhere as well. It says here that my multimedia presentation must be at least a combination of four different elements or content forms such as text, audios, images, animations, videos, interactive context, and etc. So at least I need to put four medias in this presentation. Also, I have to upload this in YouTube, and I need to upload it via Google Classroom to my lecturer for the marks. So, without further ado, let's move on to the contents. So, to my fellow viewers, this is the content that I have found based on what I have searched about for this topic. So, I have split it into five main topics. The first one being the topic introduction, of course, where I'm going to give you guys a brief definition, for what I'm going to go through. And then also I will be talking about the objectives. Why did I choose situational and cultural context? What are the objectives that I'm trying to reach upon? What are the aims that I'm looking forward when I'm choosing these contexts for Malaysian primary classrooms? And then we move on to the second main point, which is situational context in a Malaysian primary school classroom. So basically, it's a context that is being used in primary school classrooms, especially for Malaysian. As we know, Malaysia is very diverse in cultures. So I will give you a definition of what is situational context in the primary school classroom in Malaysia, the examples of that we use, and also the importance of this context in language learning, or more precisely in classrooms for students. And then we move on to the next point, which is cultural context also in a Malaysian primary school classroom. So this is basically the same thing. We'll be talking about the definition, the examples, and also all of the definition examples. How does it relate with the importance in learning or in language learning? The fourth one is the connection between situational and cultural context. So when we talk about the connection. We're talking about how can this be developed in schools? How can it be more effective? How can we use a situational and cultural context more in depth for students to gain more abilities to be more confident when they're learning. So we're looking forward to the social interaction and also the role of the teacher. Now, the role of the teacher is very important in this content because as we teachers, we need to really pay attention on how we can use this context on its most full potential. And then we move on to the last point, which is the conclusion, which I will conclude all of these four main topics into one slide. So we move on to the next one. So this is the first main point, the opening of everything. When we talk about a research, when we talk about anything that is related with assignments, with researches or findings, we're talking about the introduction. We're going for the topic introduction, which I will give you a brief explanation of what I'm going into. Just the big umbrella. We're talking about the general situation and the culture context in general. We're not focusing more on the classroom, we're not focusing on the education context, but more on the general field. So, what is situational context? So, when we talk about situational context, there are a lot of definitions we can take about in many people who can define what situational context is. But for my research, I have come up with just one conclusion, which is it covers what is physically present around the speakers or listeners at the time of communication. So, to put it simply here, situational context is where you develop or communicate face to face. For example, what I'm doing right now may not be situational context because I'm talking to my fellow viewers asynchronous or online. For example, like when you're in a lecture, a lecturer is giving you notes or teaching you face to face in the classroom. So therefore, that could be situational context. For example, that's the general of the example. I'm going to give more in depth in the Malaysian classroom for the next slide. And then we move on to the cultural context. So when we talk about culture, we talk about the diversity of people. We're talking about the races, the ethics, and such that is related with the human being. So when we talk about cultural context, it is related to the society where individuals are raised in and at how the culture affects behavior. So when we talk about the cultural context, we're talking about how the culture affects one to think or to communicate with others. So let's give an example, Malaysia. All right. When we talk about Malaysia, Malaysia is a very diverse country filled with many diverse people that come from different backgrounds, races, and ethics. So when we talk about different races, of course, there are different ways of communicating. For Malays, they're talking like this. For Chinese, maybe their talking is a bit different. For Indians, the way they talk, maybe sometimes it's more something like this, something like that. So it differs based on the race and ethics, and each communication actually has its own ethics on how the way they pronounce, how the way they enunciate the words, how the way they deliver them, in which way, the formality, and such. So cultural context is the primary target that we need to focus on as teachers when we want to teach our students. So that's why all of these are related with the quote that I just read on the previous slide, which is context of situation forms part of context of culture. So by context of culture is meant the meanings, assumptions we share as a community of people. Therefore, the context that we're trying to deliver is not just by one people. We need to make sure that our context, our contents are delivered that all people can understand because as teachers, we are prioritizing on how we want to deliver our knowledge to these students fairly without being judgmental to anyone. Especially in Malaysian context, we have diverse people. We have Malays, Chinese, Indians, Kadazans, Ibans, Sarawaks, and Sabahans. So we have a lot of people. So by learning these contexts, it will develop not only the teacher's part, but also the student's part on how to communicate better and efficiently. So that's why it says it also incorporates the culturally evolved expectations of ways of behaving and getting things done. So maybe what Hammond is trying to deliver here is that when we learn how to understand one culture works, we get to know, oh, Chinese is like this because it's their culture. Indians, the way they talk like this is because it's their culture. Malays, the way they react like this, maybe it's because it's part of their culture. So we need to respect each people's diverse background. So that's why it is important for us to learn these different contexts. So let's move on to the next slide, which is the objectives. So we move on to the objectives of what I am trying to achieve throughout my research about the context. So I have found two objectives, and I want to aim these two to make sure that I reach my objectives. So the first one is I want to explore how these contexts are relevant to teaching in a Malaysian primary school classroom, meaning that I want to know whether by learning situational context and cultural context is relevant to the Malaysian primary school classroom, because we know that certain things are not to be taught in school, especially in primary school. Like, for example, for cultural context, maybe some students don't know about certain cultures. Maybe they need to develop these cultural knowledge when they are in high school. So that's why I did this research, whether it is relevant or not to be taught in Malaysian primary classrooms, and should it be implemented more in the primary school system in Malaysia. And then we move on to the second objective, which is I want to explain the importance of situational and cultural context in language development and communication, meaning that I want to tell to my fellow viewers that the importance of why we need to learn these contexts, especially in the educational field for language development and communication, because as we know, we are moving with time, we are developing with technology, we are going forward more into such diverse technologies that we live in. So by learning these contexts, not only teachers but students will know how to communicate well, not only face to face but also in online platforms, on how they want to use it, how they want to communicate, the formality of which they want to use to communicate with people. So these objectives are created to see whether it is relevant or not for me to take these two contexts to be implemented in the primary school classrooms. So we move on to the next slide. So, my fellow viewers, we are now going in depth about the context that I have just explained before. We are going to go in depth about the situational context in the Malaysian primary school classrooms. So, I have found a lot of researches, a lot of findings based on this content, but I will try to deliver it as simple and as brief as I can. So, to open up, I start off with this: observe through the specific conditions in which teaching and learning take place, influenced by the physical environment, social dynamics, and cultural expectations. So, to put a more simple terms, is that you're there to experience it. For example, in schools, you're a teacher and you have 30 students in front of you and you are teaching them. For example, you're teaching them nouns, so you're teaching them face to face. The students can interact with you directly. So for the definitions here, it explains the situational context, helps define how students interpret and respond to the lesson. For example, if you are in a situational context, it is easier for you to communicate with your students because you are there to experience it. You're not doing it asynchronously or doing it online via Google Meet. You are doing it live there. You can interact with students, you can give them feedbacks. So this is easier. For instance, during a storytelling activity, a student might use more formal language when speaking to the teacher, but adjust to a more casual tone when interacting with peers in group work. So this is more of the types of situational context. Situational context is where you are there to communicate with people, and then we have types of situational context where when we want to deliver information, we don't use just one type. For example, I want to talk to my friend. Of course, I will use an informal tone because it's way better and easier to talk to them. But let's just say I want to use formal tone for my lecture. Does it suit? Yes, it does. It suits the tone and the formality because you are talking to someone who is older than you and they're teachers, so you have to respect them. So this applies in the classroom as well. For example, students know how to differentiate the tone and formality when talking to peers and talking to the teachers. So it also explains it in the third bullet point: use differing types and styles of communication in each of these settings, like I just said before. and this the impact of a person's cultural belief, norms, and attitudes. So when we talk about how we deliver, how we want to communicate, especially from students who are from diverse backgrounds, they have their own ways of delivering content, the ways of their delivering information. So therefore, as a teacher, it is very important for us to know how they deliver this and why do they use certain tones, certain methods, the way of their talking to the teachers, though it may sound like this, but it's actually their culture. So we need to know why and how did it impact us as teachers. We need to take it very seriously on how students communicate with each other and with us based on their backgrounds. So when they know how to differentiate, how to talk to their friends, how to talk to their families, how they want to talk with the outside world, like for example, they want to go to the shop, buy something, what kind of tone they want to use, how they want to deliver their content, how they want to talk to the teachers, this will enable them to become excellent communicator because they learn how to recognize, to differentiate situations on how they want to communicate. So that is the first slide definition for the situational context in Malaysian primary school classroom. So let us move on to the next slide, which is the examples of the situational context. So, to my fellow viewers, these are the examples of that I have found. There are a lot of examples, but I will only talk about two, which is easier for me to deliver in the primary school classroom context. So when we talk about situational context, we're talking about the ability to be there, the ability to respond immediately of how the context is delivered. That is situational context. Therefore, storytelling and public speaking is one of the primary examples that we can see in situational context because we want to deliver these two contexts, storytelling and public speaking. We need to have an audience, a live audience that can interact with us, especially in storytelling, because when we are giving a story, we want students to react. For example, we're giving a sad storytelling, we can see the reactions, we know that we are delivering the right context. That's why it's called situational context, meaning that we know how to deliver the content that we want based on what we want to aim. For example, I'm talking in a very formal tone because I'm doing a research. Therefore, maybe I have achieved what I aim from my situational context, but I lack the ability to be in front of my audience. Therefore, this may not be as a situational context for us, for both me and my fellow viewers. But we're going to go in depth about the examples of storytelling and public speaking in the Malaysian primary classroom. So each of these situational contexts demonstrates how the environment, social roles, and purpose of an event influence the way language is used in Malaysian primary school classrooms. Now, when we talk about Malaysian primary school classrooms, we are flooded with diverse cultures. So that's one. And then these varied settings encourage students to adapt their communication styles, helping them to become more versatile language users. Now, when we talk about the variability of cultures in Malaysia, we have a lot. And when we want to do storytelling, we have a lot of stories that we can tell. We are already known for Malay folklores. We have a lot. Maka Masuri, Batu Belah Batu Betangko, Si Tanggang, The Ungrateful Son, a lot. That is only just one culture. We haven't learned about the Chinese culture yet, the Indians, the Ibans, the Kadazandusuns, the Sarawakians, the Sabahans. They have their own cultures and they have their own stories to tell to us and they have their own folklores. So when we adapt this in the classroom, not only they will learn about the cultures, but they will be more versatile language users because they know how to communicate in their way. For example, Malay knows how to communicate with Chinese people, with Indians. They know how to use specific tones, specific ways, specific pronunciations to talk with them. So that's why storytelling is one of the examples. And then we move to public speaking. Now, public speaking is more to the formality. Now, we know in Malaysia we have a lot of culture. And each culture talks differently, reacts differently, behaves differently. So for public speaking, we know that, for example, like formal public speaking, we are using one language, for example, English. So when we talk English, we are using the formal English way of talking. So from here, we will teach students how to pronounce better, how to talk better in one language. So from here, we can create a unity from every aspect of the culture itself. Next, we move on to the next slide. So we have moved on to the third sub main topic for the situational context in Malaysian primary classrooms, which is the importance of this context in language learning. So the first one is it will help students to understand the relevance of code switching depending on context. So like I just elaborate before this, it will develop students' critical thinking, cognitive thinking on how they want to speak to someone, how they want to communicate via formal or informal tone. So this will come up to the second bullet point, which is it will prepare students to adapt their communication to different situations. So when they know how to relevant themselves to communicate based on the context, it will develop the students' adaptation to communicate in various fields, especially in classrooms, because in classrooms we are involving the students with many people, with their friends and with their teachers. And in homes, how do they talk with their family, how they talk with their cousins. It's also will teach them how to be a more versatile language users. For example, like formal exams versus casual conversations. Now, when we talk about formal exams, of course, the students need to use formal tones. When they're communicating with the teachers, they need to use a formal and respectful tone because they're teachers, they're educators, and they're older, so we need to respect our elders. And casual conversation is where they can have the conversations more freely, more we talk about less formal or informal because it's their friends. It's way easier to communicate informally rather than formally because it would be weird if students talk to their friends like the way they talk to their lecturers. So, to conclude, the importance of this context in language learning is that it will help students to adapt their communication skills based on different fields and different people with different situations. So that is the end for the second main topic. We will move on to the next main topic. Ladies and gentlemen, we are delving into the cultural context in a Malaysian primary school classroom. So let's just delve into the definition itself. So we know that in the Malaysian primary school classroom, this context plays a crucial role due to the country's multicultural and multilingual society, where Malaysia is a home to various ethnic groups, including Malays, Chinese, Indians, and even the indigenous people, where each with its unique cultural values, beliefs, norms, and even social practices. So, when we talk about cultural context, we're talking about how one is influenced by their culture, the way they behave, the way they talk, the way they dress themselves. It explains on how they present themselves based on the culture that they are exposed to or the culture that they are influenced with. So that is why that cultural context plays a significant role in shaping how language is used, interpreted, and understood within the classroom environment. So when we are teaching in a classroom that is filled with many people with many ethics from different backgrounds, we will start to see how language is being used by our students. We will start to see how these languages are being interpreted and how it is understood based on their culture. So we will go on one of the, not one, but a few examples of what cultural context is in the Malaysian primary school classroom. So here are a few examples that we can see on the cultural context that we are exposed to in the primary classroom for Malaysia. So the first one is the textbooks. Now, the special thing about Malaysia is that we are introduced to language classes in Mandarin language and Tamil language, where it has their own textbooks. Therefore, we can see here that the culture is being preserved. We are not only focusing on one culture, but we're also preserving many cultures there is in Malaysia because we are living in a diverse country. We are living in a very multilingual country, so we have to preserve each ethics and each values, each culture there is with full respect. And from the cultures, we can also learn there are many influence on how the language is used. We will learn on the religious influence on language use, for example, in Islamic, in Buddhism, in Christianism, in Judaism. We learn how communications are affected based on the religious of one student. So from here, we can learn a lot about the cultural context. That's why as teachers, we need to be aware of our nation, Malaysia. We have to be aware of the multilingual people there is in our school, especially for SKs, because SKs are flooded with many diverse students, unlike SJKC and SJKT, which only focuses on certain cultures. For example, SJKC, we're focusing on Chinese, and SJKT, we're focusing on Tamil, but for SKs, we're focusing on all of the cultures respectively. And when we are focusing more about the cultures, we get to learn about their specialty, about their expertise in how they produce, on how they expose their cultures to each other. So from here we have examples of each culture, Malays, Indians, and Chinese, of their famous folklores. For example, for Malays, we know the mouse deer and the crocodiles, of course. And the Chinese, we have the Shihan and the snail. For the Indians, we have Rabindranath Tagore himself, which wrote the Champa Flower. So when we learn these folklore tales about all of the cultures in Malaysia, we get to reflect the cultural diversity, therefore creating a unity not only in the classroom, but we are creating unity in our nation itself. So we are moving to the importance of why cultural context is important in language learning, especially in Malaysian primary classrooms. So I have found three primary points. The first one is it will enhance communication skills. The second one will be it will develop cross-cultural awareness and sensitivity. And the third one, it will create social and cultural identity. Now, when we learn about context, we're talking about how we want to communicate and deliver information. Therefore, that's why it enhances communication skills. And then when we talk about culture, we are exposing ourselves to many diverse cultures. Therefore, it will create cross-cultural knowledge. Malays will know about Chinese culture will know about Indian culture, and vice versa. And when we learn how to cross culture these things, we will develop awareness and sensitivity. Therefore, it will relate with the third main topic, which is social and cultural identity, where we get to protect Malaysia's identity as one unity and as one diverse country. So, we are moving to the fourth main point, which is the connection between situational and cultural context. Now, we're looking forward to the social part, where this multilingual environment requires teachers to accommodate these different linguistic backgrounds while teaching in Malay, which is the national language, or English as a secondary language. And students' cultural and language differences influence the way they learn, as well as how they communicate with each other and their teachers. So this will relate with the next point, which is the third, fourth, and fifth point, that goes classrooms often reflect the cultural diversity of the community, especially during national or religious holidays. And when they reflect these activities, the diversity of the community, these celebrations allow students to showcase their cultural heritage, leading to lessons and classroom activities that focuses on the importance of these events. The classroom will most likely become a place of cultural exchange where students are encouraged to speak about their traditions in their mother tongue or through shared activities such as just as I have mentioned before, which is storytelling, and it could also be songs or even games. And then we move on to the next point, which is the role of the teacher themselves. Now, teachers may also integrate culturally specific terms or perhaps expressions or even stories into lessons to help students to better understand the cultural context of the celebration. So these adjustments will not only foster a sense of belonging but also cultural pride among students, where students will develop self-awareness of how valuable their culture is. So, ladies and gentlemen, we have reached the final point, which is the conclusion. Out of everything that I have come up with, everything that I have done my research for, my findings, I have come up to the conclusion, which I found that situational and cultural contexts are essential in language learning, particularly in Malaysia's diverse primary school classrooms. And the context for situation refers to the specific environment or circumstances that shape how language is used and understood in general. So these contexts are crucial for fostering effective communication and understanding in multicultural classroom. Therefore, I forgot to mention the second context, which is the cultural context, which involves the values, beliefs, and practices of different cultural groups, which they will influence communication and behavior most probably. And from that, teachers need to modify their language and teaching approaches to accommodate students' cultural backgrounds. They, meaning the teacher, needs to embrace situational and cultural context in education to prepare students to navigate Malaysia's diverse society. And the last one, it will integrate. Teachers need to integrate these contexts into classrooms more, where the practices will help to nurture global awareness and inclusive citizens for a multicultural future for Malaysia.